I was at 8,000 feet above the Philippine Sea when the sunset stopped being beautiful and became a weapon, when the orange light that had been painting the horizon transformed into something that could kill, and my Zero was shaking from turbulence or from my own hands trembling on the stick because I'd just watched the American pilot emerge from the sun's glare like a blade made of pure light. Had watched him materialize from brightness that should have been empty air and erase 3 aircraft from my squadron in the span of maybe 5 seconds, without any of us even seeing him clearly enough to return fire. The sun was dropping toward the water, creating that particular horizontal illumination that turns the sky into layers of gold and shadow. And we'd been hunting the lone American fighter for 20 minutes, had spotted him running low on fuel or ammunition, and had moved to intercept with 6 Zeros in perfect formation. And our squadron leader had positioned us with the sun at our backs because that was tactical doctrine. That was what every pilot learned in training. Keep the sun behind you so the enemy has to look into brightness to find you. But this American had somehow reversed that advantage, had used the sun not as backdrop, but as concealment, had hidden himself inside the glare so completely that when he attacked, he wasn't attacking from a direction we could defend against. He was attacking from inside light itself. And where his guns fired, aircraft fell, and my wingman Sato screamed over the radio, "I can't see him, I can't see anything." And then his voice cut off, and I saw his Zero trailing smoke and spinning toward the ocean, and I rolled hard left, and the American passed so close that I could see his silhouette against the sun, could see the shape of his Hellcat backlit by orange fire. And I understood in that moment that we hadn't been hunting him at all. He'd been hunting us, had been waiting for exactly this light, exactly this angle, had turned the sunset into geometry that made us blind and made him invisible. And the thought that formed in my mind as I dove away from the formation was simple and terrible. The sun wasn't a sunset anymore, it was his weapon. And we'd flown straight into it. Before I explain how he turned the sunset into a weapon, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Takeshi Yamamoto, and I flew the Mitsubishi A6M0 for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and I'm telling you this story 78 years after it happened, because I've decided that silence is heavier than shame, that carrying this memory alone has been worse than speaking it aloud, even if speaking it means admitting that I survived that day by running, by breaking formation and diving for the ocean while better men than me stayed and fought and died. I grew up in Hiroshima before the bomb, in a city that still exists in my memory as a place of wooden houses and stone gardens and the particular quality of light that comes off water. And I'd wanted to fly from the first time I saw a Navy seaplane practicing touch-and-go landings in the harbor, had watched it rise and fall and rise again, and had felt something shift in my chest. Some understanding that the sky was where I belonged, even though my father wanted me to inherit his pharmacy and my mother wanted me to become a teacher. I joined the Navy in 1938 when I was 17, had lied about my age because the minimum was 18 and I couldn't wait another year. Couldn't stand the thought of spending 12 more months on the ground when there were aircraft that needed pilots and skies that needed exploring. The training had been brutal in ways that American pilots probably couldn't imagine. Brutal not just physically, but spiritually, designed to break you down and rebuild you as something that could function under conditions that would paralyze normal humans. We flew until our hands cramped on the stick, flew until we could navigate by stars alone, flew until we could identify aircraft types by silhouette at distances that seemed impossible. And through it all, the instructors told us that we were the tip of the spear, that Japan's expansion depended on air superiority, that the Zero was the finest fighter aircraft ever built, and that we were being trained to extract every possible advantage from its capabilities. The Zero was a revelation, Was everything the instructors claimed and more, was so light and maneuverable that it could turn inside anything the Americans or British could field, had range that let us escort bombers hundreds of miles and still have fuel to engage and return. And in the early years of the war, we were unstoppable, were the masters of every sky we entered, and I accumulated victories over the Philippines and over New Guinea and over the Solomon Islands, watched American fighters fall trailing smoke, and felt pride that was almost religious in its intensity. Felt like I was part of something larger than myself, something that would be remembered as the moment Japan proved its superiority over the Western powers that had tried to contain us. But war changes, and by 1944 the Americans had learned from their losses, had developed tactics that neutralized our maneuverability advantage, had built aircraft like the Hellcat and the Corsair that were faster and more heavily armed than the Zero, and most importantly, they had numbers, had the industrial capacity to replace every loss with 3 new aircraft, while we struggled to replace every loss with 1. And the replacement pilots we received were increasingly young and poorly trained because Japan no longer had time or fuel or experienced instructors to provide the kind of extensive training that had produced my generation. I watched the quality of our squadrons decline, watched rookies make mistakes that would have been drilled out of them in peacetime training, watched good pilots die not from American skill, but from mechanical failures we couldn't repair because parts weren't available, from fuel that was so contaminated with impurities that engines seized, from exhaustion that came from flying too many missions with too little rest, because we didn't have enough pilots to rotate duties properly. The stories about American aces started circulating sometime in mid-1944, stories that sounded like propaganda at first, descriptions of individual American pilots who'd accumulated impossible numbers of kills, who flew with abilities that suggested either supernatural talent or gross exaggeration by the people telling the stories. We'd hear about pilots who could shoot while inverted, who could predict our maneuvers before we made them, who seemed to have perfect situational awareness that let them track multiple targets while engaging one. And initially, we dismissed these stories as face-saving lies told by pilots who'd been beaten and didn't want to admit they'd been outflown by ordinary opponents. But the stories kept coming, kept accumulating details that were too consistent to be fabrication. And gradually, we began to understand that the Americans had produced a generation of pilots who were genuinely exceptional, who'd learned from 2 years of combat experience and had developed skills that our doctrine hadn't prepared us to counter. My squadron leader was a man named Kurita, who'd been flying since 1941 and who had 32 confirmed victories. And Kurita told us that the stories about American aces were real, but that they were also irrelevant, that individual skill mattered less than discipline and formation integrity, that if we stayed together and followed doctrine, we could defeat any opponent, regardless of their personal abilities. We believed him because we needed to believe him, because accepting that the Americans had pilots who were simply better than us would have meant accepting that all our training and discipline and spiritual preparation were insufficient, and that acceptance would have broken something essential in our ability to continue fighting. So we flew our missions, and we followed our doctrine, and we maintained our formations, and we told ourselves that if we just stayed disciplined and stayed together, we'd survive. And that belief sustained us through months of increasing losses until the day when it was proven catastrophically wrong. The mission briefing that morning in October of 1944 had been straightforward. Patrol the approaches to Leyte Gulf, intercept any American aircraft threatening our naval forces, return to base. Intelligence had reported a lone American fighter operating in our sector, possibly a reconnaissance aircraft, or possibly a pilot who'd gotten separated from his formation. And our squadron leader, Kurita, had decided that 6 zeros against 1 American was sufficient force to guarantee success while still allowing us to continue our primary patrol. We took off from our base on Cebu and climbed to altitude over water that was so blue it hurt to look at directly. Water that stretched to every horizon without variation, except for the occasional island or the wakes of ships moving south toward the invasion beaches. The weather was perfect, was the kind of flying weather that made you remember why you'd wanted to be a pilot in the first place. Clear sky with unlimited visibility and wind that was steady enough to be predictable but strong enough to make flight interesting. We spotted the American at maybe 20 miles, spotted his contrail before we could see the actual aircraft, and Kurita positioned us for an intercept that would give us every advantage, had us climb to altitude advantage, and positioned us with the sun at our backs. And we moved into attack formation that staggered our aircraft so that we could provide mutual support while still allowing each pilot clear firing lanes. The American was flying a Grumman F-6F Hellcat, and even at distance I could see that he was alone. No wingman, no supporting element, just one aircraft against our 6, and Kurita's voice came over the radio saying this would be an easy victory, saying we should close carefully and ensure the kill rather than rushing and potentially letting him escape. But as we closed distance, something about the American's flight path started bothering me, started creating unease that I couldn't quite articulate. He was flying straight and level, wasn't taking evasive action, wasn't showing any indication that he'd spotted us despite the fact that we were approaching from his 6 o'clock with altitude advantage. And his lack of reaction suggested either he was incompetent or he was deliberately baiting us into position, and nothing about the way he was flying suggested incompetence. His aircraft was smooth and steady, and his navigation was precise, and he was maintaining airspeed and altitude with the kind of consistency that indicated an experienced pilot who knew exactly what he was doing. I mentioned this over the radio, said something felt wrong about how exposed he was making himself, but Kurita told me to maintain formation and prepare to engage. And I obeyed because obedience was reflex, was what years of training had made automatic. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, was maybe 30 minutes from touching the water, and the light was taking on that particular quality that happens during the golden hour, when everything becomes saturated with color and shadows become long and visibility becomes simultaneously better and worse, depending on what direction you're looking. We were approaching from the west, with the sun behind us, which meant the American would have to look into brightness to see us, would be at disadvantage if he tried to spot us visually. And this seemed like confirmation that we had tactical superiority, that the engagement would proceed exactly as doctrine predicted. Kurita gave the order to attack, and we nosed down into diving attack that would give us speed advantage and would bring us into firing range in seconds, and I armed my guns and prepared to fire. And that's when the American did something that I still don't fully understand. He rolled inverted and pulled into a climb that brought him directly toward the sun, climbed into the glare so steep and so fast that he should have stalled, should have lost airspeed and fallen out of the sky, but instead he kept climbing, kept accelerating into brightness that made it impossible to track him visually, and I lost sight of him completely. Couldn't see anything except the sun's overwhelming glare and the after images it created in my vision. Kurita was calling out positions over the radio, was trying to coordinate our attack, but his calls were becoming uncertain, were filled with qualifications and guesses rather than definite observations, and I could hear frustration in his voice, could hear him realizing that we'd lost visual contact with our target and didn't know where he'd gone. Then Sato's voice came over the radio, my wingman, and he was saying, "Above us, he's coming from above." And I looked up reflexively and saw nothing except sun and sky and brightness that made my eyes water. And then Sato's voice changed to scream and cut off, and I saw his zero trailing smoke and spinning, and I understood with sudden terrible clarity that the American hadn't run from our attack. He'd used the sun as concealment, had climbed into brightness that made him invisible, and had reversed our advantage, had positioned himself so that we were now the ones looking into glare, while he could see us perfectly silhouetted against darker sky below. Kurita's aircraft exploded, just came apart in mid-air from cannon fire that I never saw coming, fire that originated from somewhere inside the sun's glare. And pieces of his Zero tumbled past me trailing smoke and fuel, and the radio was chaos, was voices overlapping and screaming and trying to call out positions and warnings, and I rolled hard left and dove because every instinct was telling me that staying in formation meant death, that the doctrine we'd relied on had been turned against us, that the American had somehow weaponized the sun itself, and was using it to kill us one by one, while we couldn't even see him clearly enough to return fire. If you're still here, you understand what these skies kept hidden. Leave a comment, so these memories survive. Another Zero fell. I saw it out of my peripheral vision, saw it take hits and start smoking, and the pilot bail out, saw the parachute open, and the man drifting down toward ocean that would swallow him because we had no rescue capability in this area. And I kept diving, kept pushing the stick forward and watching my airspeed climb past safe limits, because safety was relative, and right now the safe thing was distance from whatever was happening in that formation. The American Hellcat passed through my vision for maybe half a second, backlit by the sun so that all I could see was silhouette. And he was so close that I could have counted rivets if I'd had time. Could have seen the pilot's face if the brightness hadn't made him invisible, and then he was gone, had climbed back into the glare. And I pulled out of my dive at wave-top level and looked back and saw the sky above me filled with smoke trails and falling debris, saw 5 smoke columns marking where 5 aircraft had been, and I understood that our entire squadron, except for me, had been destroyed in maybe 20 seconds by an opponent who turned physics and geometry and the sun's position into weapons more effective than guns. I flew home alone, flew low over the water where I hoped the American wouldn't see me, where I could use the ocean as backdrop that might make me harder to spot. And the entire flight back I kept checking over my shoulder, kept scanning the sky for the Hellcat that I was certain would appear to finish what the American had started. But he never came, either didn't see me or didn't consider me worth pursuing, and I made it back to base and landed and shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit shaking so badly that the ground crew had to help me climb out. The intelligence officer wanted my report immediately, wanted to know what had happened to the rest of my squadron, and I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, came out sounding like I was making excuses or hallucinating. And when I said that the American had used the sun as a weapon, the intelligence officer looked at me with expression that suggested he thought I was suffering from combat fatigue or shock. They sent me to the flight surgeon, who asked questions about my sleep and my stress levels, and whether I'd been experiencing intrusive thoughts or nightmares. And I tried to tell him that what I'd seen wasn't symptom of breakdown, but was actual tactical innovation that we needed to understand and counter, that American pilots had apparently learned to use natural phenomena as force multipliers in ways our doctrine didn't account for. But he didn't want to hear tactical analysis, wanted to evaluate whether I was fit to return to flight status. And eventually, I learned to tell him what he wanted to hear, learned to say that yes, I was sleeping fine, and no, I wasn't having nightmares, and yes, I felt ready to fly again. But I wasn't fine, couldn't be fine after watching 5 men die, because we'd followed doctrine that assumed the sun was just backdrop rather than potential weapon. And every subsequent mission I flew, I was hyper-aware of sun position, would refuse to engage targets that were positioned between me and bright light, would break off attacks if the geometry started looking like that day over the Philippine Sea. And my squadron mates noticed my reluctance and started calling me coward, started saying I'd lost my nerve. And maybe they were right. Maybe I had lost something essential that day, but I'd also gained something, which was understanding that the Americans had evolved beyond our doctrine, had developed tactics that were so sophisticated they seemed like magic, and that fighting them required adapting or dying. I survived the war by being careful, by never again putting myself in position where an opponent could use natural phenomena against me, by treating every engagement as potential trap rather than opportunity for glory. And this caution kept me alive when braver men died, kept me flying when my squadron was decimated multiple times and rebuilt with increasingly inexperienced pilots who didn't survive their first missions. After Japan surrendered, I spent years trying to forget what I'd seen, trying to bury the memory of that American pilot who turned sunset into weapon. But forgetting was impossible. The memory was too vivid, too detailed, had been burned into my mind with the same intensity as the sun's glare that had blinded us. I never learned the American's name, never found out if he survived the war or died in some later engagement, never discovered whether what he'd done that day was standard American tactic or individual innovation. But I've thought about him constantly, have wondered whether he knew how many men he killed that day, or whether we were just silhouettes to him, targets without names or faces or families. And I've wondered whether he understood that he'd taught me something about war that all my training had missed, which was that the deadliest weapons aren't always the ones you carry with you. Sometimes they're the ones you find in the environment and learn to use while your opponent is still thinking conventionally. I'm 95 years old now, living in Tokyo in a country that barely resembles the one I fought for, and I'm telling this story because I've decided that testimony matters even when testimony is uncomfortable, that there's value in admitting when you've been beaten by someone who was simply better, who saw possibilities you didn't see and exploited them before you understood they existed. The American ace who turned the sunset into a weapon was as real as the 5 men who died that day, and whatever his name was and whatever happened to him after the war, he demonstrated something that I think every pilot should understand, which is that tactical advantage isn't just about aircraft performance or weapons or numbers. It's about seeing the battlefield differently from your opponent, about recognizing that every element of the environment can be either tool or obstacle, depending on how you choose to use it. Subscribe if you want more testimonies that official reports never dared to record, because the war in the Pacific was full of moments like this. Moments where individuals did things that shouldn't have been possible, where the sky itself became weapon or sanctuary depending on who understood it better, and these moments shaped outcomes in ways that statistics and strategic analyses can't capture. Some pilots used guns, and some pilots used tactics, and some pilots, like that American ace, used everything available, including the sun itself. And it was enough to break us, enough to show us that all our training and discipline and spiritual preparation were insufficient when confronted with someone who'd learned to weaponize reality itself, who'd turned something as simple and beautiful as a sunset into geometry that killed. And that lesson has stayed with me for 78 years, has shaped how I understand not just combat, but existence, has taught me that the world is always more dangerous and more full of possibility than we imagine, and that the difference between predator and prey often comes down to who sees those possibilities first.